The mahogany boardroom door burst open with a theatrical bang that would have made Broadway proud. 12 distinguished board members in their $1,000 suits turned in unison, expecting to see the final candidate for the assistant position. Instead, they found themselves staring at 4 feet of pure chaos wrapped in pink tulle and enough glitter to blind a satellite. "Mama said to tell you she's really sick and I should come for the job thingy instead," announced Serafina Knox, her voice carrying the absolute confidence that only preschoolers possessed when delivering earth-shattering news. She clutched a juice box in one tiny fist, apple, from the looks of the cartoon on the side, and her princess dress sparkled with every step as she marched into the pristine boardroom like she owned the place. Which, considering the way the universe seemed to tilt on its axis the moment she appeared, maybe she did. At the head of the gleaming conference table, Dominic Blackthorne felt his Mont Blanc pen snap clean in half. The sound was sharp and final like his sanity. His wolf, the predator that had helped him claw his way to the top of both the business world and the North American pack hierarchy, was having what could only be described as a complete and utter meltdown. Every instinct he'd honed over 34 years of life was screaming one impossible word. Mate, about a 4-year-old, who was currently eyeing his quarterly reports with the calculating look of someone about to reorganize his entire filing system. "These papers are all mixed up," Sarah announced, setting down her juice box with the gravity of a judge delivering a verdict. "Don't worry, I'll fix them." Before anyone could stop her, not that anyone seemed capable of movement at the moment, she began sorting through the documents spread across the table. Her method appeared to be entirely color-based, creating neat little piles of what had previously been carefully ordered financial projections. Blue ones go here, white ones go there, and ooh, this one has pretty charts. She held up what Dominic was fairly certain was their most confidential merger proposal, studying it like it might contain the secrets of the universe. "Are these your crayons? They're not very colorful." Board member Harrison Wells, a man who'd faced down corporate raiders and hostile takeovers without blinking, looked like he might faint. "Sir, perhaps we should. Do you have any cookies?" Sarah interrupted, abandoning the papers to beam up at Dominic with eyes the color of summer storms. "Job meetings should always have cookies. That's what Mama says. She says cookies make everything better, especially when grown-ups get all grumpy and forget to smile." As if to demonstrate proper cookie meeting etiquette, she climbed up onto one of the leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars, her little legs swinging as she settled in like she was claiming a throne. Dominic's wolf was practically howling. Not in distress, though there was plenty of that, but in recognition. The kind of soul-deep knowing that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the mystical bonds that governed werewolf existence. This tiny hurricane of glitter and juice boxes was his destined mate. The same tiny hurricane who was now pulling what appeared to be a half-eaten sandwich from a sparkly purse and offering to share it with him. "It's peanut butter and jelly," she said helpfully. "But I already ate the crusts because they're the best part. Mama says I'm weird, but I think she's the weird one for not eating crusts." Dominic cleared his throat, which felt suspiciously tight. "Where exactly is your mother, miss?" "Knox. Serafina Elizabeth Knox, but everyone calls me Sarah because Serafina is too many letters, and I'm not good at all of them yet." She swung her legs more enthusiastically, causing her chair to spin slightly. "Mama's at home being sick in the bathroom. She said she was supposed to come see you today about being your helper, but she couldn't stop throwing up, so I should come instead because I'm very responsible for my age." The matter-of-fact way she delivered this information made Dominic's chest do something uncomfortable. His wolf was torn between the urge to protect and the equally strong urge to find the nearest therapist who specialized in supernatural identity crises. "And how exactly did you get here?" asked Patricia Morrison, the only female board member, her voice carefully controlled. Sarah brightened even more, which shouldn't have been physically possible. "Mrs. Henderson from next door drove me. She said it was very important business, and I looked very professional." She gestured to her glittery dress as evidence. "This is my best outfit. I wore it to my cousin's wedding and everything." Dominic closed his eyes and counted to 10. Then 20. When he opened them, Sarah was still there, now somehow in possession of his stress ball and squeezing it with the focused determination of someone defusing a bomb. "This is squishy," she observed. "Do you squeeze it when you're scared? I have a teddy bear for that, but he's at home watching cartoons." "I'm not scared," Dominic said automatically. Sarah studied him with the kind of intense scrutiny that small children were famous for, the kind that seemed to see straight through all your carefully constructed adult defenses. You look scared, she decided. And sad. Are you sad because you don't have any cookies? I could share my sandwich. The offer was made with such genuine concern that something in Dominic's chest cracked wide open. His wolf settled slightly, recognizing something pure and untainted in this small person who'd wandered into his sterile world like a force of nature. That's very kind of you, he managed. Sarah beamed at him, and for a moment, the boardroom full of concerned executives and the impossible situation faded away. There was just this little girl with storm-colored eyes and a heart big enough to offer her lunch to a stranger. Then she stood up on the chair, wobbled slightly, and announced, I think I should get the job. I'm very good at organizing things by color, and I know lots of songs if you get bored, and I promise I won't eat all your cookies if you get some. She paused, considering. Well, maybe just the chocolate chip ones. But only because those are the best and someone should appreciate them properly. Harrison Wells made a strangled sound that might have been laughter or hysteria. Dominic found himself standing, moving around the table toward this impossible child who'd just turned his entire world upside down. She watched him approach with curious eyes, completely unafraid of the predator that most people could sense even when they didn't understand what they were sensing. When he was close enough, she held out her hand like she was greeting an equal. I'm very pleased to meet you, mister, she said in a voice that suggested someone had been teaching her proper manners. Blackthorn, he said, taking her tiny hand in his much larger one. The contact sent electricity straight through him, and his wolf practically purred with satisfaction. Dominic Blackthorn. That's a very fancy name, she said approvingly. I like it. It sounds like a prince name. If only she knew how close to the truth that was. Now, she said, settling back into her chair with the air of someone conducting very important business. About those cookies. Chapter 2. The funeral was small, which somehow made it worse. Serafina Knox stood at the graveside in a black dress she'd borrowed from her roommate, watching them lower her mother into the ground with a numbness that felt protective and terrifying all at once. The pastor said nice things about Elena Knox's courage in fighting her illness, about her devotion to her daughter, about finding peace after struggle. What he didn't mention was the mountain of medical bills that had arrived like clockwork even after the treatments stopped working. Bills that now belonged to Sarah, along with a student loan debt that made her stomach hurt and a future that felt about as solid as smoke. She was 22, college-educated, and completely alone in the world. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent 4 years studying business management only to discover she was spectacularly bad at managing her own life. Her mother had hidden the true scope of their financial situation right up until the end, probably trying to protect her from one more worry she couldn't fix. Now Sarah stood in the rain, watching her mother disappear forever, and tried to figure out how she was going to pay for a funeral she couldn't afford for a woman who died owing more money than Sarah would probably make in the next decade. Miss Knox. She turned, blinking raindrops from her lashes, to find a man in an expensive suit standing a respectful distance away. He was tall, dark-haired, and somehow familiar in a way that made her chest tighten with recognition she couldn't place. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered from that day 14 years ago when she'd burst into a boardroom looking for cookies and job interviews. Mr. Blackthorn. The name came out automatically, pulled from a memory she'd treasured for years. The nice man with the sad eyes who'd bought her cookies from the vending machine and listened to her explain why princesses were actually very good at business. He looked surprised that she remembered, which was ridiculous. You didn't forget someone who'd treated a 4-year-old like she was worth taking seriously, especially when most adults just patted her head and told her she was cute. I wasn't sure you'd remember, he said. You bought me cookies, she said simply. And you listened to my very important presentation about why Disney princesses would make excellent CEOs. Most adults don't do either of those things. Something flickered across his face, pleasure maybe or pain. It was hard to tell with the rain and the grief making everything feel distant and strange. Your mother came to work for me after that, he said. She was an excellent employee for several years before her illness forced her to leave. Sarah nodded. She remembered her mother talking about the job at Blackthorn Industries, how it had been the best position she'd ever had, with benefits that had covered Sarah's medical expenses and a boss who'd been understanding when she needed time off for school events or sick days. What she hadn't known until the bills started arriving was that her mother had borrowed against the company's medical program to cover the experimental treatments insurance wouldn't touch. Borrowed and borrowed until the debt had grown into something monstrous. "Miss Knox," Dominic said, and there was something careful in his voice now. "I wonder if we might discuss your mother's employment contract. There are some complications that need to be resolved." The numbness in her chest crystallized into something sharper. Of course. Even at her mother's funeral, the bills couldn't wait. "How much do I owe?" she asked quietly. "Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more appropriate. My office tomorrow morning?" Sarah looked around at the nearly empty cemetery, at the handful of neighbors and church friends who'd come to pay their respects, at the simple headstone that had cost more than she had in her checking account. "How much?" she repeated. Dominic was quiet for a long moment, rain collecting on his dark hair and expensive coat. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle in a way that somehow made everything worse. $873,000. The number hit her like a physical blow. She actually staggered, one hand reaching out instinctively to steady herself against a nearby headstone. "That's..." She couldn't finish the sentence. There weren't words for what that was. It was more than a house. It was more than most people made in their entire careers. It was impossible. "Miss Knox, Sarah, I want you to know that Blackthorn Industries isn't interested in pursuing aggressive collection methods. Your mother was a valued employee, and we understand that circumstances were extenuating." He was being kind, she realized dimly, trying to soften the blow of financial ruin with corporate speak and gentle tones. It almost made her laugh, except laughing felt like it might crack something inside her that wouldn't heal. "What does that mean exactly?" she managed. "It means I have a proposition for you." The Blackthorn Industries building looked exactly the same as it had 14 years ago, all gleaming glass and steel reaching toward the sky like a monument to corporate success. Sarah stood on the sidewalk outside, wearing her best interview suit, the one she'd bought for job interviews that hadn't panned out, and tried to work up the courage to go inside. $873,000. The number had been circling in her head all night, along with memories of her mother working late into the evening, stress lines deepening around her eyes as the medical bills piled up. Elena Knox had been fighting a war on two fronts, against cancer and against bankruptcy, and she'd lost both battles in the end. The least Sarah could do was face the consequences with dignity. The elevator ride to the top floor felt both endless and far too short. When the doors opened, she stepped into a reception area that screamed wealth and power in subtle, expensive ways. Everything was pristine, coordinated, and probably cost more than her college tuition. "Miss Knox." The receptionist looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. "Mr. Blackthorn is waiting for you." Sarah followed her down a hallway lined with what were probably original paintings, trying not to think about how out of place she looked in this world of marble and mahogany. The corner office was exactly what she'd expected. Massive windows overlooking the city, furniture that probably had its own insurance policy, and behind a desk the size of a small aircraft carrier, Dominic Blackthorn. He looked different in his natural environment. More commanding, more dangerous. The kind of man who could destroy companies with a phone call, and probably had. But when he looked up and saw her, something in his expression softened. "Sarah, thank you for coming. Thank you for seeing me." She sat in the chair he indicated, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. Her mother had raised her to have good manners, even when the world was ending. "I want to discuss payment terms for my mother's debt. I have a different suggestion." He opened a folder on his desk and pulled out what looked like a contract. "My executive assistant recently gave notice. The position comes with a substantial salary, full benefits, and a signing bonus that would significantly reduce your financial obligations." Sarah blinked. "You're offering me a job?" "The salary is $200,000 a year, plus performance bonuses. The signing bonus is $500,000. He slid the contract across the desk toward her. "In addition, the position comes with a company apartment in the building's residential floors. Fully furnished, all utilities included." She stared at the numbers on the paper, certain she was misreading something. This is too much. You'd be working directly with me, managing my schedule, handling confidential communications, coordinating with international offices. The compensation reflects the responsibility of the position." "Mr. Blackthorn." She looked up from the contract to meet his eyes. "I just graduated with a degree in business management. I have no experience as an executive assistant. I've never managed an international schedule or handled confidential anything. Why would you offer this to me?" He leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin tingle in a way that was probably inappropriate during debt negotiations. "You made quite an impression 14 years ago," he said finally. "I remember thinking you had excellent organizational skills and a remarkable ability to see solutions where others saw problems. I was 4. You were 4 and you reorganized my quarterly reports by color in a way that actually made them easier to read." The corner of his mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "My filing system has been color-coded ever since." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You're not serious." "I'm always serious about business." He gestured to the contract. "The question is whether you're interested. The apartment has heated bathroom floors, if that influences your decision." Despite everything, the grief, the crushing debt, the surreal nature of this entire conversation, she laughed. Actually laughed, for the first time in weeks. "You remembered that I care about heated bathroom floors? You mentioned it 7 times during our initial meeting, along with your theories about optimal cookie placement in conference rooms and why all important documents should be organized by color rather than date. I was a weird kid. You were an interesting kid." His voice went softer. "I imagine you've become an interesting adult." There was something in his tone that made her pulse quicken, but she pushed the feeling aside. This was business. Surreal, life-altering business, but business nonetheless. She looked at the contract again, at numbers that would solve every financial problem she had, and then some. "What's the catch?" "No catch. There's always a catch." Dominic was quiet for a moment, and she had the strangest feeling he was debating something with himself. "The hours can be demanding," he said finally. "I travel frequently, often with little notice. The work is confidential and sometimes stressful. And," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "I can be difficult to work with. I have high standards and very little patience for incompetence." "Are you trying to talk me out of taking the job?" "I'm trying to be honest about what you'd be signing up for." Sarah looked around the office, taking in the luxury and power that surrounded them. Then she looked at the contract that would change her entire life. $200,000 a year. $500,000 signing bonus. Heated bathroom floors. "When would I start?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing." She picked up the pen he offered and signed her name at the bottom of the contract before she could lose her nerve. "Welcome to Blackthorn Industries, Miss Knox," Dominic said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. "I think this is going to be a very interesting arrangement." The apartment was ridiculous. Sarah stood in the middle of what the building directory called a junior penthouse, and tried to process the fact that this was apparently where she lived now. The space was bigger than the house she'd grown up in, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the entire city. The furniture looked like it belonged in a magazine spread, all clean lines and expensive fabrics in shades of cream and gray. And the bathroom floors were indeed heated. She'd discovered that fact 20 minutes ago when she'd walked into the master bath and nearly wept at the sight of marble floors that warmed her bare feet, and a shower with enough space for a small cocktail party. Her phone buzzed with a text from her former roommate. "How's the new job? Still can't believe you're working for a billionaire." Sarah typed back, surreal. "The apartment has a wine fridge. Please tell me you're not going to fall for your boss." Sarah looked around at the luxury surrounding her, at the life that had fallen into her lap like something out of a fairy tale. "He's way out of my league. This is just business." Even as she typed the words, she wasn't entirely sure she believed them. There had been something in Dominic's eyes when he looked at her, something that made her pulse quicken and her cheeks flush. But that was probably just her imagination. Successful, powerful men like Dominic Blackthorn didn't fall for broke recent college graduates, no matter how much they might have charmed him as children. This was about business, about debt and opportunity and heated bathroom floors. And if she sometimes caught herself wondering what it would be like to see him smile, really smile, not the careful professional expression he wore like armor, well, that was between her and the wine fridge. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number. "Your first day starts at 7 a.m. Coffee preferences? D." She stared at the text, at the casual familiarity of that single-letter signature, and felt something flutter in her chest. "Surprise me," she typed back. The response came almost immediately. "Dangerous words, Miss Knox." Sarah set her phone aside and walked to the windows, looking out at the city lights stretched below her. Somewhere out there was her old life. Student loans and uncertainty and grief that still sat heavy in her chest. But here, in this impossible apartment with its heated floors and million-dollar views, was something new. Something that felt like possibility. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and tried to ignore the way her skin still tingled where Dominic had brushed her fingers when handing her the pen. Tomorrow, she would start her new job working for a man who remembered a 4-year-old's opinions about cookies and had apparently been thinking about color-coded filing systems for 14 years. Tomorrow, her real life would begin. And if that life happened to include a boss whose smile made her forget how to breathe properly, well, she'd just have to figure out how to be professional about it. The heated bathroom floors would definitely help. Chapter 3. 3 weeks into her new job, Sarah had compiled a mental list of things that were weird about working for Dominic Blackthorne. First, the man never got sick. Not even a sniffle. She'd been his executive assistant for 21 days and had watched him work 18-hour days, survive on what appeared to be nothing but black coffee and sheer willpower, and attend back-to-back meetings without so much as a yawn. Meanwhile, she'd already caught a minor cold from the office air conditioning and spent 2 days sniffling through conference calls. Second, his business dinners had very strange timing. She'd noticed the pattern by week 2. Every 28 days, Dominic would block out his entire evening for what he called pack meetings with his senior staff. When she'd asked about catering arrangements, he'd given her a look that was equal parts amused and horrified. "No catering necessary," he'd said. "We prefer to hunt for our own refreshments." She'd assumed he meant they were going to some trendy farm-to-table restaurant. Rich people had weird ways of talking about food. Third, his executive team was suspiciously attractive. Not just good-looking in the way that successful people often were, but attractive in a way that seemed almost predatory. They moved with a fluid grace that made her think of dancers or martial artists, and they had this habit of tilting their heads and sniffing slightly when meeting new people. She'd mentioned this to Prt1, the CFO, during a budget meeting. "Do you have allergies?" she'd asked politely after watching him test the air like a sommelier examining wine. "Something like that," he'd replied with a grin that showed slightly too many teeth. But the weirdest thing about working for Dominic Blackthorne wasn't his supernatural immune system, or his eccentric staff, or even his habit of conducting phone calls while pacing like a caged animal. It was the way he looked at her, like she was something precious and fragile and absolutely essential to his continued existence. Like he was constantly fighting the urge to wrap her in bubble wrap and hide her away from anything that might cause her harm. It should have been creepy. Instead, it made her feel safer than she'd felt since her mother died. She was thinking about this contradiction while organizing his schedule for the week when Patricia Morrison, the head of legal, burst into the outer office without knocking. "Is he in?" Patricia demanded, and there was something wild in her eyes, something that made Sarah's instincts prick with unease. "He's in a conference call with Tokyo," Sarah said carefully. "But I can interrupt if it's urgent." Patricia was already past her desk and pushing through Dominic's office door. Sarah heard raised voices, Patricia's sharp with panic and Dominic's dropping to a growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. She caught fragments. "Hostile takeover. Meridian Corporation. They know about the Territory." Then Patricia's voice, high and tight with fear. "They're not just after the company, Dom. They're after the pack." The silence that followed was somehow worse than the shouting. Sarah stared at her computer screen, pretending to type while straining to hear more. "Territory? Pack? What kind of business terminology was that?" Her phone buzzed with an internal call. Dominic's voice was carefully controlled when she answered. "Sarah, I need you to cancel my afternoon appointments and hold all calls. And," he paused, "order lunch for the executive team. The usual." "What's the usual?" she asked, realizing she'd never actually arranged food for his staff meetings. Another pause. "Raw steaks. Very raw. And Patricia prefers hers still warm." Sarah blinked at her computer screen. "I'm sorry, did you say raw steaks? The restaurant on 5th Street knows our preferences. Just tell them it's for the Blackthorne account." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone and wondering what kind of restaurant served raw steak and whether she should be concerned about her boss's dietary choices. She was still puzzling over this when the elevator dinged and Prt1 stepped out, followed by 3 other members of the senior staff. They moved in formation, she noticed, like a military unit or a hunting party. "Emergency meeting?" she asked. "Something like that," Marcus replied, and again with that too-sharp smile. "Is he?" "Agitated," Sarah supplied, since that seemed like the most diplomatic way to describe the dangerous energy radiating from Dominic's office. "Thought so. We could smell it from the elevator." Sarah paused in her typing. "Smell it. Anger has a very distinctive scent," said Rebecca Liu, the head of operations, as if this was perfectly normal office conversation. "Especially his anger." They disappeared into Dominic's office, leaving Sarah alone with the growing certainty that she was working for the weirdest company in corporate America. The meeting went on for 2 hours. Occasionally, voices would rise loud enough for her to catch words. Territory, challenge, pack loyalty. But mostly there was just the low rumble of serious conversation punctuated by what sounded distinctly like growling. She'd worked in offices before. She'd never heard growling in a boardroom. When the raw stakes arrived, and they were indeed very, very raw, she knocked once and entered to find 6 of the most powerful people in the business world tearing into bloody meat with their bare hands. She said, setting the delivery bags on the conference table while trying not to stare. Lunch. Thank you, Sarah, Dominic said without looking up from what appeared to be a completely uncooked ribeye. Could you close the door behind you? She backed out quickly, wondering if there was an HR protocol for executives who ate like wolves. The thought stopped her cold. Wolves? She shook her head, dismissing the ridiculous notion. Just because they had strange eating habits and moved with predatory grace and seemed to communicate in growls didn't mean they were. What? Werewolves? This was real life, not a fantasy novel. Although it would explain the sniffing. At 5 o'clock, the executive team finally filed out of Dominic's office. They looked calmer now, more settled, like the raw meat had somehow soothed whatever crisis they were dealing with. We'll handle the Meridian situation, Marcus told her as they waited for the elevator. Don't worry about updating the press releases until tomorrow. What exactly is the Meridian situation? Sarah asked. The elevator doors opened, and Marcus stepped inside before answering. Territorial dispute, he said just as the doors closed. Sarah stared after them, her unease growing. Territorial dispute? What kind of corporation talked about business conflicts like they were animal behavior documentaries? She was still thinking about this when she knocked on Dominic's door at 6:30. Come in, came his voice, rougher than usual. She pushed the door open and immediately knew something was wrong. The office felt different, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle and her pulse quicken. Dominic stood behind his desk with his back to her, shoulders rigid with tension. Your 7 o'clock called to reschedule, she said carefully. And I have the quarterly reports you requested. Leave them on the desk. His voice was strained, like he was fighting for control. Are you all right? The question slipped out before she could stop it. He turned, and Sarah's brain temporarily short-circuited. His eyes were wrong. Instead of the dark brown she'd grown accustomed to, they were gold. Not hazel or amber, but genuine gold like molten metal. And his teeth? Are those colored contacts? She heard herself ask. Because they're really realistic, but also kind of illegal in most workplaces. Dominic froze, his hand halfway to his mouth, as if he'd been about to cover his definitely too sharp canines. Sarah, he said carefully, this isn't what it looks like. It looks like you're wearing costume fangs and gold contact lenses in your office at 6:30 on a Tuesday. She tilted her head, studying him with the same analytical approach she used for budget reports. Are you feeling okay? Because this seems like stress-related behavior, and I could call your doctor. I don't have a doctor. Everyone has a doctor. I don't get sick. You mentioned that before, but statistically speaking. Sarah. The word came out as a growl, and she watched in fascination as his pupils dilated. I need you to sit down. Why? Are you having some kind of episode? Should I call security? Please don't call security. He ran a hand through his hair, and she noticed his fingernails were longer than they'd been this morning. And sharper. Just sit down. There are some things I need to explain. Sarah remained standing, her practical mind cataloging impossible details. Let me guess. You're going to tell me you're a werewolf. The silence that followed was deafening. That was supposed to be a joke, she said slowly. Dominic sank into his chair, his gold eyes never leaving her face. I know. But you're not laughing. No. Because it's not actually a joke. No. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, then calmly pulled out her phone and began typing. What are you doing? Dominic asked, a note of panic in his voice. Googling workplace safety regulations for supernatural entities, she said without looking up. Because I'm pretty sure this constitutes a hostile work environment, and I need to know if I qualify for hazard pay. Despite everything, the impossible situation, the golden eyes, the very real possibility that her boss could probably tear her throat out, Dominic Blackthorne threw back his head and laughed. It was a rich, warm sound that seemed to fill the office and ease some of the dangerous tension that had been crackling through the air. When he looked at her again, his eyes had returned to their normal brown, though his canines were still distinctly pointed. Hazard pay, he repeated, shaking his head. Of all the reactions I imagined. What did you expect? Screaming. Running. Calling the authorities. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. Not HR concerns. Well, I mean, screaming seems counterproductive. And running would be stupid since you could probably catch me. She pocketed her phone and finally took the seat he'd offered. As for authorities, who exactly would I call? The werewolf police. There actually is a werewolf police of sorts, Dominic said. The council regulates pack behavior and territorial disputes. Is that what this Meridian thing is about? A territorial dispute? He nodded slowly. Meridian Corporation is owned by a rival pack. They're trying to force us out of our territory, this city, by destroying our business base. And your business base is actually pack territory. Yes. He watched her carefully, as if waiting for her to bolt. Blackthorn Industries isn't just a company. It's how we maintain our territorial claims, support pack members, and interface with the human world. Sarah processed this information with the same methodical approach she used for everything else. So your entire executive team, werewolves, all of them. That explains the sniffing. Enhanced senses come with the transformation. And the raw meat, dietary preferences, and the fact that you never get sick. Accelerated healing and enhanced immune systems. She nodded thoughtfully. What about the full moon thing? Do you actually turn into wolves, or is that just mythology? We can shift at will, but the full moon makes it easier. More natural. It's when we typically gather as a pack for hunts and territory runs. Business dinners, she said, understanding dawning. Business dinners, he confirmed. Sarah leaned back in her chair, staring at the man who'd just casually upended everything she thought she knew about reality. He looked normal now, aside from the fangs, just her incredibly attractive boss who apparently turned into a wolf on weekends. So, she said finally, about that hazard pay. Dominic's laugh was softer this time, tinged with something that might have been relief. I think we can arrange something. Good. Because I'm pretty sure potential mauling by supernatural predators wasn't in my job description. She paused, considering. Although it does explain why the salary was so generous. The salary was generous because... He stopped himself, a flush creeping up his neck. Because you're important to me, he said quietly. More important than you realize. There was something in his voice, in the way he was looking at her, that made her pulse skip. But before she could ask what he meant, her practical mind reasserted itself. I have questions, she announced. I imagined you would. Lots of questions. Starting with, if you're all werewolves and this is pack territory, where exactly do I fit in? Am I like, pack adjacent? A consultant? What's my official supernatural status? Dominic went very still. That's complicated. Complicated how? There are certain aspects of werewolf society that are difficult to explain without additional context. Sarah narrowed her eyes. You're being evasive. I'm being careful. About what? He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. About the fact that you're my mate. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Your mate, she repeated slowly. Werewolves mate for life. When we find our destined partner, we know. Instantly. Completely. His golden eyes met hers. I've known since you were 4 years old. Sarah stared at him, her mind racing through implications and complications and the sheer impossibility of what he was telling her. That's why you've been watching over me, she said, pieces clicking into place. The anonymous scholarships, the coincidental job opportunity, the debt that disappeared. I couldn't approach you directly. You were too young, and then you were human and unaware of our world. But I couldn't stop myself from making sure you were safe. Protected. Provided for. You've been stalking me for 14 years. I prefer the term benevolent oversight. Despite everything, Sarah felt her lips twitch. That's just fancy stalking. Expensive stalking, Dominic corrected solemnly. Do you have any idea how much those anonymous college funds cost? She laughed, surprising herself. Here she was sitting in her boss's office, discussing werewolf politics and supernatural stalking and mate bonds like it was a performance review. So what happens now? She asked. Now you decide, Dominic said. You can walk away. I'll make sure you're financially secure, that you never have to worry about money again. You can forget about werewolves and pack territories and go live a normal human life. Or you stay. You learn about our world, our laws, our customs. You accept your place as my mate and the pack's Luna. His voice dropped to something raw and vulnerable. You let me love you the way I've wanted to for 18 years. Sarah looked at him, really looked, and saw the man who'd bought cookies for a 4-year-old, who'd spent 14 years making sure she was safe and happy and never knew she was being watched, who'd given her a job and a home and heated bathroom floors because he remembered what she'd cared about as a child, who was looking at her now like she held his entire world in her hands. I have more questions, she said. I know. A lot more questions. I know. And I want that hazard pay in writing. Done. And I get to meet the rest of the pack properly. No more pretending your senior staff are normal humans when they're clearly supernatural predators. Agreed. She stood up, smoothing down her skirt, and walked around his desk until she was close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to catch his scent, something wild and woodsy that made her think of forest runs and midnight hunts. And I want you to show me, she said softly. Show you what? What you really are. Dominic's breath caught. Sarah, I'm not afraid of you, she said, and realized it was true. I've never been afraid of you. Even when I was 4 years old, and you were this big, intimidating businessman, I knew you were safe. I knew you'd never hurt me. I would die before I let anything hurt you. I know. She reached out and touched his face, her fingertips tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone. So show me. Show me who you really are. And as she watched Dominic Blackthorne, billionaire CEO, Alpha King, and apparently her destined mate, smiled at her with golden eyes and fangs, and began to explain exactly what it meant to be loved by a wolf. Chapter 4. The first gift arrived on a Tuesday morning. A bouquet of white orchids, so elaborate it required its own delivery team, and nearly blocked the elevator doors. The card was embossed with gold lettering that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly grocery budget. For a woman of exceptional taste and beauty. Looking forward to our lunch. M. Steele. Sarah stared at the card, then at the orchids, then at Marcus Chun, who'd emerged from the elevator behind the delivery team, looking like he'd caught a whiff of something distinctly unpleasant. Problem? She asked. Marcus's nostrils flared slightly, a habit she now recognized as supernatural scenting rather than seasonal allergies. Those flowers smell like... He paused, seeming to search for diplomatic phrasing. Like territorial aggression and bad cologne. They smell like orchids to me. Trust me, there are other scents layered in there. Ones you can't detect. He had the massive arrangement with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for explosive devices. Who's M. Steele? Marcus Steele, CEO of Lunar Enterprises. He's taking me to lunch today to discuss a potential collaboration between our companies. The silence that followed was pregnant with supernatural tension she was still learning to recognize. Marcus Steele, Marcus Chun repeated slowly. As in Marcus Steele, Alpha of the Northern Territory Pack. Marcus Steele, whose company has been trying to acquire our client base for the past 3 years. Is that bad? It's complicated. Sarah was beginning to hate that word. Complicated how? Before Marcus could answer, Dominic's office door opened, and he stepped out, took one look at the orchid explosion dominating the reception area, and went completely still. Where did these come from? His voice was carefully controlled in a way that made Sarah think of barely leashed predators. Marcus Steele sent them, she said. We're having lunch today to discuss business. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dominic's eyes flicked to the card in her hand, then back to her face. You're having lunch with Marcus Steele. That's what I just said. To discuss business. Yes, Dominic. Business. You know, that thing we do here every day. Marcus Chun made a sound that might have been a snort of laughter, but when Sarah looked at him, his expression was carefully neutral. Sarah, Dominic said, and there was something in his voice that made her pulse quicken. Marcus Steele isn't just a rival CEO. I gathered that from the territorial aggression comments. He's the alpha of a competing pack. His interest in you isn't professional. How do you know? Because... Dominic stopped himself, jaw clenching. Because no one sends 60 orchids for a business lunch. Sarah looked at the flowers again. She hadn't counted them, but now that he mentioned it, the arrangement was rather excessive for a professional meeting. Maybe he's just enthusiastic about potential partnerships. The look Dominic gave her could have melted steel. He's enthusiastic about something. Are you jealous? The question popped out before she could stop it. I'm concerned about pack security. That's not what I asked. Dominic's eyes flashed gold for just a moment before he got himself under control. Yes, he said through gritted teeth. I'm jealous. I'm jealous and possessive and barely restraining myself from shredding those flowers and marking you so thoroughly that every supernatural in a 50-mile radius knows you belong to me." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt heat bloom in her cheeks. "But," Dominic continued, his voice returning to professional calm, "you're not Pac yet. You haven't accepted the mate bond, which means you're free to have lunch with whomever you choose. Even if he's your territorial rival. Even then. And you'll be fine with that. I'll be professional about it." Marcus chin coughed. This should be interesting. Marcus Steele was, objectively speaking, gorgeous. He had the kind of classical good looks that belonged on magazine covers: sharp jawline, storm gray eyes, dark hair that looked casually tousled but probably required expensive styling products to achieve. His suit was perfectly tailored, his smile was blindingly white, and when he stood to greet her at Le Bernardin, every woman in the restaurant took notice. "Serafina," he said, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was either charmingly old-fashioned or slightly presumptuous. "You look absolutely radiant." "Thank you," she said, retrieving her hand and noting the way his eyes tracked the movement. "And thank you for the flowers. They're beautiful. Not nearly as beautiful as you." He held her chair as she sat, his fingers brushing her shoulders in what was probably meant to be a casual touch. "I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of ordering wine. A Chablis Premier Cru. I thought it would complement your sophistication." Sarah settled into her chair and tried not to think about how different this felt from her daily interactions with Dominic. Where Dominic's attention felt warm and protective, Marcus's felt intense. Calculating. "So," she said, opening her menu, "you mentioned a potential collaboration between our companies. Among other things." Marcus's smile was predatory in a way that had nothing to do with supernatural abilities. "I'm always interested in acquiring valuable assets." "Assets?" "Companies, territories, talented individuals." His gaze lingered on her face. "I have a particular appreciation for rare and precious things." Something about the way he said it made her skin crawl, but she pushed the feeling aside. This was business. She could handle a little corporate flirtation. "What kind of collaboration did you have in mind?" "A merger, perhaps. My company has resources that could significantly enhance Blackthorn Industries' market position." He leaned forward slightly. "Of course, such arrangements require a great deal of trust. Personal investment." "Personal investment?" "The most successful partnerships are built on intimate understanding between key stakeholders." His hand moved across the table toward hers. "I'd very much like to get to know you better, Serafina." She moved her hand to her water glass before he could touch her. "That's very flattering, but I'm not a stakeholder. I'm just an executive assistant." "You're much more than that." His eyes glittered with something that made her think of hunting predators. "You're Dominic Blackthorn's right hand." "His confidant." "His." He paused, as if tasting the words. "His weakness." The comment sent ice through her veins. "I'm sorry. Powerful men often have blind spots when it comes to the women they care about." Marcus's smile didn't waver, but there was something cold behind it now. "It makes them vulnerable. Easier to outmaneuver." Sarah set down her water glass with deliberate calm. "Mr. Steele, if you're suggesting that I would betray my employer's trust." "Of course not." He waved a dismissive hand. "I'm simply observing that proximity to power creates opportunities. And I'm a man who appreciates opportunity." The waiter appeared to take their order, giving Sarah a moment to process what was happening. Marcus Steele wasn't interested in a business merger. He was interested in using her as leverage against Dominic. The realization should have made her angry. Instead, it made her curious. "Tell me," she said once the waiter had departed, "what exactly is your history with Dominic?" "We're competitors." Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "We have philosophical differences about territory and leadership." Philosophical differences. He believes in collaborative approaches to resource management. Shared territories. Peaceful coexistence. Marcus's lip curled in disdain. Weak strategies that limit growth potential. "And you believe in?" "Decisive action. Clear hierarchies. Taking what you want and holding it." His eyes fixed on hers. "Some things are worth fighting for." The way he said it made her think he wasn't talking about market share. That's a very aggressive business philosophy. It's effective. He leaned back in his chair, studying her like she was a puzzle he was solving. "Though I suspect you appreciate a more refined approach. You strike me as someone who values being cherished. Protected. Claimed. Claimed." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "Forgive me. Poor word choice." But his smile suggested it had been entirely intentional. I meant treasured. A woman like you deserves to be treasured by someone who understands your worth. And you think Dominic doesn't understand my worth? I think Dominic Blackthorne is too constrained by outdated notions of propriety to properly pursue what he wants. Marcus's voice dropped to something intimate and predatory. If you were mine, Serafina, there would be no question about your place in my life. No professional boundaries. No hesitation. If I were yours? When, he corrected softly. When you're mine. The presumption in that single word made her blood boil. But before she could respond, their appetizers arrived. Marcus launched into what was clearly a prepared monologue about his company's expansion plans, his vision for market dominance, and his appreciation for beautiful things that enhanced a man's status. Sarah smiled and nodded, and made appropriate responses while mentally cataloging every red flag he was waving. By the time their entrees arrived, she'd counted at least a dozen references to claiming, territory, and possession that had nothing to do with business strategy. You know, she said during a lull in his territorial dissertation, you have a very interesting way of talking about business relationships. How so? All this talk about claiming and marking territory and establishing dominance. She took a sip of her wine. It sounds more like a nature documentary than corporate strategy. Marcus went very still. I suppose I have a colorful way of expressing myself. It's almost like you're talking about animal behavior rather than market dynamics. His eyes flashed with something that wasn't entirely human. Perhaps we're not so different from animals when it comes to the things we want most. Perhaps, Sarah agreed mildly. Although most animals are more subtle about their hunting strategies. The silence that followed was charged with tension, and Sarah realized she'd just called out an alpha werewolf on his predatory behavior while sitting in one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. You're very perceptive, Marcus said finally. It's part of my job description. And what else is part of your job description? Protecting my employer's interests. Even when those interests conflict with your own? What makes you think they conflict? Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to something that was probably meant to be seductive, but came across as vaguely threatening. Because Dominic Blackthorne is holding you back, Serafina. You're settling for scraps when you could have everything. Everything. Position. Power. Influence. A place at the side of someone who isn't afraid to take what he wants. His hand moved toward hers again. You deserve to be claimed by someone worthy of you. This time she let him take her hand, mostly to see what he would do with the victory. His fingers tightened around hers with possessive pressure, and she felt something that might have been supernatural energy crackling between them. Not the warm, protective feeling she got from Dominic's touch, but something colder. More predatory. I appreciate the offer, she said calmly, but I'm perfectly happy with my current position. Are you? His thumb traced over her knuckles in a gesture that was clearly meant to be intimate. Or are you simply afraid to reach for something better? I'm not afraid of anything, Mr. Steele. Marcus, he corrected. And I hope that's true. Because fear is such a limiting emotion. He was still holding her hand, his grip just a little too tight to be comfortable, when her phone buzzed with a text message. Emergency board meeting in 30 minutes. Need you back ASAP. D. I have to go, she said, gently but firmly extracting her hand from Marcus's grip. Work emergency. Of course. His smile was sharp with disappointment and something else. Calculation, maybe. Duty calls. Thank you for lunch. And the flowers. This won't be our last meal together, Serafina. He stood as she gathered her purse, his voice carrying the weight of a promise and a threat. I'm very persistent when I want something. So I've noticed. As she walked away from the table, Sarah could feel his eyes tracking her movement like a predator watching prey. The sensation stayed with her all the way back to the office, along with the uncomfortable realization that Marcus Steele wasn't just interested in a hostile takeover of Blackthorne Industries. He was interested in a hostile takeover of her. The emergency board meeting was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed in her brief but eventful career at Blackthorne Industries. She'd barely made it back from lunch when she was swept into the main conference room along with the entire senior staff. The atmosphere was thick with tension and what she now recognized as supernatural energy, though it manifested in distinctly corporate ways. The Lunar Enterprises proposal arrived 20 minutes ago. Patricia Morrison was saying as Sarah slipped into her seat at the side of the room. They're offering a comprehensive merger package. Comprehensive, growled Rebecca Liu, is one word for it. What are the terms? Dominic asked, his voice carefully controlled, but his posture screaming barely leashed predator. They want majority stake, board control, and executive restructuring. Patricia slid a thick folder across the table. In exchange, they're offering premium market value plus integration bonuses for key personnel. Integration bonuses? Assuming those personnel are willing to adapt to new management styles. Marcus' chin made a sound like a snort. They want to absorb our pack structure into theirs. That's one interpretation. Sarah raised her hand tentatively. Excuse me, but could someone translate that into human resources terminology? The room went quiet, and she realized everyone was looking at her with varying degrees of concern and calculation. They want to eliminate our current leadership structure, Dominic said finally, and integrate our employees into their corporate culture. Which means, said Rebecca, they want to force our pack to submit to their alpha or face territorial exile. Can they do that? If they acquire controlling interest in our business holdings, they can challenge our territorial claims through the council, Patricia explained. Corporate structure and pack hierarchy are legally intertwined in supernatural law. Sarah processed this information with growing unease. So this merger proposal is actually a supernatural takeover attempt. Exactly. And Marcus Steele is trying to use his relationship with me as leverage in that takeover. The silence that followed was deafening. What relationship? Dominic's voice was dangerously quiet. The one he thinks he's building, Sarah clarified quickly. He spent most of lunch talking about claiming me and establishing dominance and making veiled threats about taking what he wants. He said he wanted to claim you? Marcus Chen's eyebrows rose. Those were his exact words? Among others. He was very territorial about the whole thing. Dominic's hands were flat on the conference table, and Sarah noticed his knuckles were white with tension. What else did he say? That you were holding me back. That I deserved to be with someone who wasn't afraid to take what he wanted. That this wouldn't be our last meal together because he's very persistent. She paused. Oh, and he kept touching my hand despite clear signals that I wasn't interested. He touched you. Dominic's voice had dropped to something that was more growl than speech. Briefly. I handled it. How? By being professional and politely discouraging while gathering intelligence about his intentions. She looked around the table at faces that ranged from impressed to concerned to barely controlled rage. Which, based on this conversation, were exactly what I suspected they were. You knew he was trying to manipulate you? Rebecca asked. I suspected. The gifts were too expensive, the compliments too calculated, and the territorial language too consistent to be coincidental. Sarah shrugged. Plus, he kept talking about business strategy like he was narrating a nature documentary. It was weird. Patricia started laughing, actual, genuine laughter that seemed to release some of the supernatural tension in the room. She played him, Patricia said, wiping her eyes. She went into that lunch knowing exactly what he was trying to do and let him think he was seducing her while she gathered intelligence. I wouldn't say I played him, Sarah protested. I just stayed alert. You stayed alert, Dominic repeated, and there was something in his voice that made her pulse quicken. Pride, maybe. Or relief. While having lunch with a predatory alpha who was trying to use you as leverage against your own pack. I'm not pack, she pointed out. I'm just an employee who happens to know about werewolves. You're more than that, Marcus Chin said quietly. Whether you've accepted it or not. Before she could ask what that meant, Dominic stood abruptly. We need to respond to their proposal, he said, his tone shifting back to business mode. Patricia, draft a rejection letter citing conflicts of interest and corporate culture incompatibility. What about Steele's personal interest in Sarah? Rebecca asked. We handle that separately. How? Dominic's eyes flashed gold. By making it very clear that she's under pack protection. And if he challenges that protection? Then we remind him why collaborative leadership doesn't mean weakness. The meeting dissolved into strategic planning that involved a lot of territorial terminology Sarah was still learning to decode. She took notes dutifully, translating supernatural politics into corporate action items while trying not to think about the predatory way Marcus Steele had looked at her across the lunch table. When the meeting finally ended and the executives filed out, she found herself alone with Dominic in the conference room. He stood at the windows overlooking the city, his posture rigid with leftover tension. You know, she said conversationally, when you said werewolf politics were complicated, you really undersold it. He turned to look at her, and she saw that his eyes were still faintly gold around the edges. Are you all right? He asked. Really all right? I'm fine. Slightly annoyed that someone tried to use me as a corporate espionage tool, but fine. He didn't hurt you? No. He was creepy and presumptuous, but not physically threatening. She paused. Well, not obviously threatening. I assume he could have been threatening if he'd wanted to be. Very threatening, Dominic confirmed grimly. Marcus Steele has a reputation for taking what he wants regardless of consent or consequences. But I'm under pack protection now? You've always been under pack protection. Now it's official. What does that mean, practically speaking? Dominic moved closer, close enough that she could smell his scent, something wild and woodsy that made her think of forest runs and predatory grace. It means, he said quietly, that anyone who wants to hurt you will have to go through me first. And if they're willing to do that, then they'll discover that collaborative leadership doesn't make me any less dangerous when it comes to protecting what's mine. The possessive edge in his voice made her pulse quicken, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed with another text message. Thank you for a lovely afternoon. Looking forward to our next encounter. M. Dominic's nostrils flared as he caught her scent change, surprise, maybe, or irritation. He's persistent, she said, showing him the message. Yes, Dominic agreed, his voice carefully controlled. He is. Should I be worried? Not as long as you stay close to the pack. His eyes met hers, and she saw something vulnerable beneath the protective fury. As long as you want to stay close to the pack. Where else would I go? You have heated bathroom floors and hazard pay. His laugh was soft and relieved. Is that the only reason? No, she said quietly. It's not. What are the other reasons? She looked at him, really looked, taking in the golden eyes and protective stance, and the way he held himself like he was ready to fight the world to keep her safe. That's complicated, she said, echoing his favorite word. I have time. Even with hostile takeovers and territorial challenges and supernatural politics? Especially with hostile takeovers and territorial challenges and supernatural politics. He moved closer still, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Because some things are more important than business. Such as making sure you know that you're not just under pack protection, he said, his voice dropping to something rough and intimate. You're under my protection. Personal, possessive, completely unrelated to corporate structure protection. That sounds very territorial. It is. And if I don't want to be protected, then I'll respect that, he said immediately. But I'll also be very unhappy about it. Despite everything, the corporate intrigue, the supernatural politics, the persistent rival alpha, Sarah found herself smiling. Very unhappy? Devastatingly unhappy. Pathetically, embarrassingly unhappy. Well, she said, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. We can't have that. No, Dominic agreed, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. We really can't. And as he lowered his head to kiss her, finally, inevitably, with 18 years of patient waiting behind it, Sarah's phone buzzed with another message from Marcus Steele. She ignored it completely. Chapter 5. The corporate retreat was supposed to be relaxing. Sarah stood on the wraparound porch of the mountain lodge, breathing in pine-scented air and watching the sun set over the peaks, and tried to convince herself that this was just an ordinary company getaway. The kind where executives did trust-building exercises and complained about the Wi-Fi, and maybe got drunk enough at dinner to reveal embarrassing personal details. Never mind that half the trust-building exercises seemed to involve an unusual amount of running through the woods. Or that the lodge's staff kept giving the Blackthorn Industries group nervous looks and extra space. Or that Marcus Chun had spent most of the afternoon sniffing the air like he was tracking something. Beautiful view, said a voice behind her, and Sarah turned to find Rebecca Liu approaching with 2 glasses of wine. It really is. Sarah accepted the wine gratefully. Though I have to admit, I keep expecting someone to suggest we go howling at the moon or something. Rebecca nearly choked on her wine. Don't give them ideas. Patricia's already been eyeing the hiking trails like she wants to mark territory. Is that what she was doing? I thought she was just really enthusiastic about outdoor activities. Patricia's enthusiasm for anything involving physical exertion is directly proportional to how much territory she can claim during the activity. Rebecca settled against the porch railing, her expression growing more serious. How are you handling all of this? Really? You mean the werewolf thing? Or the fact that my boss is apparently my destined mate? Or the part where a rival alpha is trying to use me as leverage in a supernatural corporate takeover? All of it. Sarah took a sip of wine and considered the question. A month ago, her biggest concerns had been student loans and whether her coffee maker was finally giving up the ghost. Now she was attending pack gatherings disguised as corporate retreats and trying to navigate supernatural politics that could apparently end in literal territorial warfare. "I'm adapting," she said finally. "Though I have to admit the learning curve has been steep. You're doing better than most humans would. Most people don't handle the revelation that werewolves exist with quite so much practical acceptance. What's the alternative? Denial doesn't make it go away, and panic doesn't solve anything." Sarah shrugged. "Besides, once you get past the whole mythical creatures are real thing, it's not that different from any other workplace with complicated politics. Complicated politics that occasionally involve people turning into wolves and fighting over territory. Every workplace has its quirks." Rebecca laughed, a sound that was equal parts amusement and admiration. "Dominic's lucky to have found you." "Is he? I'm still not entirely sure what I bring to this situation." "You bring stability, grounding, a perspective that isn't clouded by centuries of pack politics and supernatural prejudices." Rebecca's expression grew thoughtful. "Plus, you make him happy in a way I haven't seen since, well, ever." Before Sarah could respond to that loaded statement, the peaceful evening air was shattered by the sound of howling. Not the mournful musical howling she'd heard in movies, but something sharp and aggressive that made every primitive instinct she possessed scream danger. "That's not our pack," Rebecca said, her posture shifting from relaxed to predatory in an instant. "How can you tell? Wrong scent. Wrong territory." Rebecca's eyes had gone gold, and her voice carried a growl that definitely wasn't human. "Someone's challenging our claim." The howling came again, closer this time, and was answered by sounds from inside the lodge, growls and the crash of furniture being overturned, and what sounded distinctly like a fight. "Stay here," Rebecca ordered, already moving toward the door. "Like hell," Sarah said, following her inside. The main lodge area was chaos. Furniture had been overturned, creating barriers and defensive positions, and the Blackthorn Industries executives were in various states of partial transformation. Patricia had claws extended and was snarling at something outside the windows. Marcus Chin was crouched near the fireplace, golden eyes tracking movement in the shadows. And Dominic. Dominic stood in the center of the room in a form that was neither fully human nor fully wolf, but something terrifyingly beautiful in between. His eyes blazed gold, his hands had extended into claws, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of an alpha addressing a challenge. "Marcus Steele," he called out, his voice carrying beyond the lodge walls. "If you want to discuss territory, we can handle this through proper channels." The response came in the form of something large and dark crashing through the main window in an explosion of glass and growling fury. Sarah dove behind the overturned couch as three wolves, actual wolves, not the partially shifted forms she'd seen from Dominic's pack, landed in the middle of the room and immediately began circling the Blackthorn group. "So much for corporate negotiations," Patricia muttered, her own transformation accelerating until she was more wolf than human. What followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed. She'd thought she understood what it meant for Dominic to be a werewolf, but watching him fight was like discovering an entirely new species of predator. He moved with liquid grace, anticipating attacks and responding with controlled violence that was both beautiful and terrifying. But the attacking wolves were outnumbered by the Blackthorn pack, and it quickly became clear this wasn't meant to be a fair fight. More windows shattered as additional attackers poured into the lodge, and Sarah realized with growing horror that this wasn't a territorial challenge. It was an ambush. "Rebecca," she called out as one of the attacking wolves blindsided the other woman, sending her crashing into the stone fireplace with a sickening crack. Rebecca hit the stones hard and didn't get up. Without thinking, Sarah abandoned her hiding spot and rushed to where Rebecca lay motionless, blood pooling beneath her head. Her corporate training kicked in, check for breathing, assess injuries, apply pressure to wounds, but the damage was extensive. Too extensive for basic first aid. "You need to get out of here," Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of fighting. "This is about you. About what you can do." "What I can do? I'm not supernatural, Rebecca. I can't shift or fight or—" "Not that." Rebecca's hand found hers, gripping with surprising strength. "The other thing. The reason people feel better around you. The reason you always know exactly what to say to make things okay." Sarah stared down at her injured colleague, at the blood and the pain and the very real possibility that Rebecca was dying, and felt something shift inside her chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with adrenaline, spreading from her heart down through her arms to her hands. "I don't understand." "Touch me," Rebecca said urgently. Put your hands on the wound and just let it happen. Rebecca, you need a hospital, not. Please. The plea in Rebecca's voice cut through Sarah's rational objections. Moving on pure instinct, she placed her hands over the gash on Rebecca's head and closed her eyes. The warmth in her chest intensified, flowing through her arms like liquid sunlight. She felt it leave her hands and sink into Rebecca's wound, carrying with it an impossible certainty that everything would be all right. When she opened her eyes, Rebecca's head wound was gone. Not healed. Gone. As if it had never existed. Holy shit, Sarah whispered. Holy shit is right, said Rebecca, sitting up with no sign of injury or pain. How long have you been able to do that? I can't do that. I've never been able to do that. Sarah stared at her hands like they belonged to someone else. I don't know what just happened. You healed me. Completely. With just a touch. Before Sarah could process this information, a pained howl cut through the air. Across the room, Marcus Chun was down, a massive wolf standing over him with blood on its muzzle. Again, Sarah moved without thinking. She sprinted across the lodge, dodging flying debris and snarling combatants, and dropped to her knees beside Marcus. The wolf above him turned golden eyes in her direction, and she realized with a shock that she was looking at Marcus Steele in his shifted form. He was beautiful in the way that apex predators were beautiful, all lethal grace and deadly power. He was also twice the size of any wolf she'd ever seen, with intelligence in his eyes that was entirely too human. Get away from him, Marcus Steele said, his words somehow clear despite the wolf form. Unless you want to see what happens to those who stand between me and what I want. What you want is me, Sarah said, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. This whole attack is about me. Not you, Marcus corrected, his massive head tilting in acknowledgement. What you can do. What you just did for her. He gestured toward Rebecca with one clawed paw. Healing like that is incredibly rare. Incredibly valuable. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? Think about it, Serafina. How many times have people told you that you make them feel better just by being around? How often have minor injuries seemed to heal faster when you've tended them? How many times have you attributed your unusual success with bedside manner to natural empathy? She thought about her mother's illness, how Elena had seemed to have good days whenever Sarah was home from college, about her roommate's migraines that always seemed to disappear after Sarah made her tea and sat with her, about the way people at work gravitated toward her when they were stressed or hurt, about the way Dominic looked at her like she was something precious and essential. It's not possible, she said weakly. Healing abilities in non-shifted humans are extremely rare, Marcus agreed, but not impossible. You're what's called a dormant healer, someone born with supernatural abilities who never manifested the shift. I'm not. You are. And you're exactly what I need. Marcus Chun groaned beneath her hands, drawing her attention back to his injuries. Without hesitation, she placed her palms against his wounds and let that strange warmth flow through her again. This time she could feel it more clearly, like sunshine made tangible, flowing from some inexhaustible well inside her chest. Marcus's injuries closed under her touch, leaving only unmarked skin behind. Remarkable, Marcus Steele said, and there was hunger in his voice that had nothing to do with wolf instincts. With abilities like yours healing my pack's warriors, we'd be unstoppable. No permanent injuries, no recovery time, no weakness our enemies could exploit. And all I have to do is what? Join your pack and spend my life patching up soldiers in your territorial wars. You'd be cherished, protected, given everything you could possibly want. Everything except choice. Marcus Steele's laugh was not entirely pleasant. Choice is a luxury for those without power. You have power, Serafina. The only question is whether you'll use it willingly or whether I'll need to make the decision for you. The threat was clear, and Sarah felt ice flood her veins. But before she could respond, Dominic's roar shook the entire lodge. She looked up to see him in full alpha form. Larger than Marcus Steele, golden eyes blazing with protective fury, every line of his body radiating barely controlled violence. If you touch her, Dominic said, his voice carrying supernatural command that made every wolf in the room freeze, I will tear you apart. Will you? Marcus Steele circled slowly, keeping Sarah between himself and Dominic. Even knowing that she's the most valuable asset in the supernatural world? Even knowing that half the alphas in North America would kill to possess a healer like her. She's not an asset. She's my mate. Your mate who didn't even know she had abilities until tonight. Your mate who's spent her entire life in the human world, completely unaware of her own power. Marcus's golden gaze fixed on Sarah. "Tell me, dear one, did your precious alpha ever mention that he could probably sense your abilities from the moment you met? Did he explain that his interest in you might have as much to do with what you can provide his pack as with destiny and romance?" The words hit like physical blows, and Sarah felt her certainty waver. Had Dominic known? Was that why he'd been so protective, so insistent on keeping her close? "That's enough," Patricia snarled, moving to flank Marcus Steele. "Is it?" Marcus kept his attention on Sarah, ignoring the other wolves positioning around him. "Ask yourself why an alpha would spend 14 years watching over a human child. Ask yourself what he really saw when he looked at that 4-year-old who could make everyone in the room feel calmer just by being there." "Dominic," Sarah said quietly, and heard the question in her own voice. For a moment, Dominic's blazing gold eyes met hers, and she saw something that looked like guilt. "I knew," he said simply. "I sensed the potential from the beginning." The admission hit her like a physical blow. Everything, the scholarships, the job offer, the protection, had been about her abilities, about what she could provide. "But," Dominic continued, his voice fierce with conviction, "I didn't know I loved you because of what you could do. I loved you because of who you are. The healing abilities just made you more precious, not more useful." "How touching," Marcus Steele said, but his attention was no longer entirely on Sarah. The other members of his attack force were moving closer to the windows, and she realized they were preparing to retreat. Unfortunately, love doesn't change the reality of supernatural politics. What reality is that? The reality that you're now the most sought-after prize in the werewolf world. Every alpha with territorial ambitions is going to want to acquire your loyalty. His gaze fixed on her again. "I'm simply the most direct about my intentions." "And what are your intentions?" "To make you an offer you can't refuse. Either you come with me willingly, and I court you properly until you accept your place at my side, or I take you by force and let you adjust to your new circumstances gradually." "Those aren't options," Dominic growled. "Those are threats. They're realities." Marcus Steele began backing toward the shattered windows. "Seraphina belongs with the pack that can best utilize her gifts, that can best protect her from others who would use her abilities for less noble purposes. And you think that's you? I know that's me." His form began to shift back toward human, though he kept his claws extended. "I'll give you a week to consider my offer, Seraphina. After that, I'll assume you need help making the right decision." "The right decision is telling you to go to hell," Sarah said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Marcus Steele smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "We'll see." He gestured to his pack, and they began their retreat through the broken windows. But before disappearing into the forest, he called back one final warning. "A week, Seraphina. Choose wisely." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood in the middle of the destroyed lodge, surrounded by overturned furniture and shattered glass and the lingering scent of supernatural violence, and tried to process everything that had just happened. She was a healer, an actual, supernatural healer with abilities that made her valuable to every werewolf pack in North America. Dominic had known, at least suspected, from the beginning, and Marcus Steele was planning to kidnap her if she didn't voluntarily join his pack. "Well," she said finally, her voice only slightly shaky, "this explains why the salary was so generous." Despite everything, Dominic laughed. "Only you would focus on employment benefits at a time like this. It's either that or have a complete breakdown about the fact that I apparently have magical healing powers and am now the supernatural world's most wanted asset." She looked around at the destruction. "Plus, I'm pretty sure our corporate retreat just turned into a literal battlefield, which probably violates several workplace safety regulations." "Probably," Dominic agreed, his form shifting back toward fully human. "Are you hurt?" "No." Confused, terrified, and possibly having an existential crisis about the nature of reality, but not hurt. "Good." He moved toward her, careful and cautious, as if afraid she might bolt. "Sarah, about what Marcus said. About you knowing I had abilities? We'll discuss that later." She held up a hand to forestall his explanations. "Right now, I think I need to sit down and figure out exactly what it means that I can apparently heal people with my bare hands." "Right now," said Rebecca, moving to start cleaning up the destruction, "I think we need to call this retreat short and get back to the city. If Marcus Steele is serious about that week deadline, we need to start planning." "Planning what?" "How to keep you safe," Dominic said quietly. "Because he's right about one thing. You're going to be the most sought-after person in the supernatural world. Every pack with territorial ambitions is going to want to acquire your loyalty." And some of them, Patricia added grimly, won't be as polite about it as Marcus Steele. Sarah looked around at the faces of the Blackthorn pack. Her pack, she realized with a start, and saw determination mixed with concern. They were going to protect her, but the cost of that protection was going to be her freedom. So what you're telling me, she said slowly, is that my life just got infinitely more complicated. Yes, Dominic said simply. And there's no going back to being a normal executive assistant with heated bathroom floors and reasonable workplace expectations. No. She sighed and picked her way through the debris toward the lodge's supply closet, stepping over broken glass and overturned chairs. Where are you going? Rebecca called after her. To have that breakdown I mentioned, Sarah replied, opening the closet door. I figure I've got about 10 minutes to process the fact that my good bedside manner is actually magic before we have to start planning for supernatural warfare. She stepped into the closet and closed the door behind her, leaving the pack to start cleaning up the mess while she tried to wrap her mind around the fact that her weird ability to make people feel better, something she'd always attributed to natural empathy and good listening skills, was apparently powerful enough to start wars over. Through the thin walls, she could hear Dominic giving orders for damage control and security arrangements, his voice carrying the authority of an alpha protecting his territory. His territory, which now included her. She slumped against the closet wall among the mops and cleaning supplies and let herself have exactly 10 minutes to panic about the fact that her life had just become the supernatural equivalent of a hostile takeover, with her as the prize everyone was fighting to acquire. Then she was going to open that door, walk back out there, and figure out how to navigate being the werewolf world's most valuable asset while maintaining some semblance of agency over her own existence. After all, she'd managed to adapt to everything else the supernatural world had thrown at her. How hard could it be? Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe, like and share this video to be the first to get notified when the part 2 of this story drops.